November 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. A machine gunner with one working arm held a defensive position for 20 minutes against a company-sized assault. His partner was dead, his gun was jammed, and his right hand hung useless at his side, shattered by shrapnel from the opening barrage. What happened next wasn't heroism in the Hollywood sense. It was mechanics, pure, desperate mechanics. Staff Sergeant Emil Dvorak learned to feed belted ammunition with his left hand while firing with his prosthetic mount. A battlefield innovation born from necessity, witnessed by 11 men and forgotten by history until a battalion after-action report surfaced in 2003. This is that story. The Hürtgen forest was not one forest. It was 50 square miles of pine and fir, ridgelines and ravines, logging roads turned into kill zones. The Germans had prepared the ground for months. They knew every trail, every sight line, every spot where American columns would bunch up and die. November in the Hürtgen meant mud that swallowed mortars, mist that turned noon into twilight, and cold that froze gun oil into sludge. The 28th Infantry Division had been grinding through these woods since early September. By mid-November, some companies were at 30% strength. Replacements arrived on Monday and died on Tuesday, sometimes without learning the names of the men beside them. Entire platoons vanished into the mist and didn't come back. The forest consumed men, not dramatically, quietly. A sniper round from 500 meters, a mine under wet leaves, trench foot that turned gangrenous because there was no way to keep your feet dry. The 28th Infantry had earned a nickname, the Keystone Division. Pennsylvania boys mostly, National Guard units federalized in 1940. They'd landed at Normandy, fought through France, and now they were dying in a forest that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Dvorak's unit, Company G, 2nd Battalion, 110th Regiment, had taken a logging station on November 12th. The structure was stone, waist-high walls on 3 sides, open to the rear. Tactically, it was a liability, but it offered hard cover in a forest where everything else was splinters and mud. He set up his Browning M1919 in the northwest corner. Fields of fire covered 2 approaches, a trail from the ridgeline and a fire break to the west. His assistant gunner, Private First Class Anthony Rinaldi, stacked ammunition cans and counted belts. They had 1,400 rounds. They had a backup barrel. They had morphine, sulfa powder, and a shared canteen that tasted like rust. They did not have reinforcements. The battalion had pushed too far, too fast. The logging station was 800 meters ahead of the main line. It controlled the trail junction, so it mattered. But mattering and being defensible are not the same thing. Command had promised support. Engineers to fortify the position, a rifle squad to provide security, maybe even a 60mm mortar team if the supply situation improved. None of it arrived. By the second night, Dvorak and Rinaldi understood they were alone. The forest was too dense for effective radio communication. The trails were too exposed for runners. The battalion was fighting its own battles 3 ridgelines to the south. So they dug in. They reinforced the stone walls with logs. They cleared sight lines. They registered range markers, a dead birch at 90 meters, a boulder at 120, a stump at 160. When the shooting started, they wouldn't have time to estimate. They needed known distances, fixed points, references they could use in the dark. Rinaldi was 19. He'd grown up in Newark. His father ran a bakery. Before the war, Rinaldi had wanted to be a teacher. He talked about it sometimes, late at night when the forest was quiet. He'd teach history, he said. American history, the kind that wasn't just dates and battles, but stories about people. Dvorak told him he'd be good at it. Rinaldi said he appreciated that. They both knew he probably wouldn't live long enough to find out. Dvorak was 26. He had worked in a Pittsburgh steel mill before the war. He understood machines. He understood tolerances, friction, and the point at which metal stops bending and starts breaking. He'd grown up around mills. His father had worked the blast furnace. His grandfather had worked the open hearth. 3 generations of Dvoraks had turned iron ore into steel, and they'd all understood the same fundamental truth. Respect the machine, or the machine will kill you. The M1919, a 4 weighed 31 pounds. It fired .30-06 Springfield rounds at a cyclic rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute. The gun fed from the left. The belt was canvas or metal link. Rinaldi's job was to guide the belt, clear jams, and swap barrels when the first one glowed red. Dvorak had trained on the weapon at Fort Benning in 1942. He'd fired thousands of rounds. He knew the gun's rhythm, the way the bolt moved, the way the barrel heated, the point at which sustained fire became dangerous. The manual said to fire in 6 to 9 round bursts. The manual said to change barrels every 2 minutes of sustained fire. The manual said a 2-man crew was essential for effective operation. The manual had been written by men who'd never fought in the Hürtgen forest. They had been in position for 38 hours when the shelling started. Not artillery, mortars. German 81mm tubes probably set up just over the ridgeline, close enough that you heard the thump of launch before you heard the whistle, close enough that you had 2 seconds to decide whether to drop or run. Dvorak and Rinaldi pressed themselves into the corner as the first rounds walked across the clearing. The Germans were ranging, adjusting, walking the impacts toward the stone walls like a man tapping a nail. The first round landed 50 meters short. The second landed 30 meters out. The third hit the wall and exploded in a shower of stone fragments. The fourth round landed inside the structure. Rinaldi took the blast full on. He was dead before the echo faded. No time to scream, no time to understand what had happened. One moment he was crouched against the wall, the next moment he was gone. Dvorak caught shrapnel in his right forearm and shoulder. The pain was immediate and absolute. His hand opened involuntarily. He couldn't close his fingers, couldn't grip, couldn't do anything but watch his hand twitch and spasm like something separate from his body. He looked at his arm and saw bone. White fragments pushing through torn muscle, blood running hot down his wrist, his fingers twitching but not responding to commands. He tried to make a fist. Nothing. He tried to grip the pistol grip. Nothing. His right hand was gone. Not severed, not missing, but functionally, completely gone. He used his left hand to drag himself back to the gun. The shelling stopped. Silence. Then voices. German voices, distant but closing. Orders being called through the trees. The sharp-clipped cadence of NCOs organizing an assault. Dvorak knew what was coming. He also knew his gun. The M19. 19 of 4 was operated by 2 men for a reason. One fired, one fed. The belt had to be guided smoothly into the feedway. If it kinked, the gun jammed. If it twisted, the gun jammed. If the assistant gunner flinched at the wrong moment and jerked the belt, the gun jammed. Dvorak's right hand was gone. Functionally, completely gone. He couldn't fire and feed at the same time. Not the way he'd been trained. So he stopped trying to do both. He looked at the weapon, he looked at his arm, he looked at the ammunition belt, and he started problem solving. The pistol grip required downward pressure to fire. The trigger required approximately 5 pounds of force. His right hand couldn't provide that force, but his forearm could still push. His shoulder could still brace. He wedged his right forearm, shattered radius, compound fracture, bone fragments grinding, against the pistol grip. He used his shoulder to brace it. He leaned his weight into the gun until his ruined arm became a fixed point, a prosthetic mount that held the grip in place. The pain was extraordinary. Every time he shifted his weight, broken bone ground against broken bone. Every time he leaned forward, the shrapnel wounds in his shoulder tore open. His vision grayed at the edges. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He ignored it. Not because he was brave, because stopping meant dying. Then he used his left hand to feed. The belt came from the ammunition can on his left side. Normally, Rinaldi would lift it, guide it, keep tension. Dvorak couldn't lift and guide. He could only pull the belt taut, hold it steady for a fraction of a second, then let his weight on the trigger do the rest. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't fast, but it worked. He test-fired 3 rounds into the tree line. The gun cycled, the brass ejected, the belt advanced. He had a system, crude, painful, unsustainable, but functional. The German assault came in 2 waves. The first was probing. 10 or 12 men moving through the firebreak, using the tree line for cover. They expected suppressive fire from the stone position. They expected someone to be alive in there, but they didn't expect effective fire. Dvorak gave them effective fire, short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds. He couldn't sustain fire because he couldn't feed continuously, but he could feed in pulses, pull the belt taut, lean into the grip, let the gun cycle, pause, feed again. The first burst dropped 2 men in the open. The rest scattered back into the trees. 60 seconds of silence. Then, the second wave. This time they came from two directions. A base of fire element on the ridgeline and an assault element pushing through the firebreak. Classic German infantry tactics, fix and flank. The Germans had been fighting in these woods for months. They knew the terrain. They knew the distances. They knew how to use the forest to close with American positions before the defenders could bring effective fire to bear. But they didn't know Dvorak was alone. They didn't know his assistant gunner was dead. They didn't know he was firing with one hand. They assumed standard tactics, standard crew, standard response times. That assumption cost them. Dvorak couldn't cover both directions, so he chose the closer threat. He traversed the gun left and fired into the firebreak. The range was 80 meters, close enough to see faces, close enough to see men go down and not get up. He fired in pulses, 3-round bursts with 2-second pauses. The rhythm was dictated by his feeding speed, not by tactical choice. He couldn't feed faster. His left hand was doing work that normally required 2 hands and full mobility. But the Germans didn't know that. All they knew was that the machine gun position was still active, still firing, still dangerous. The gun was hot now. The barrel was discoloring. He could smell the paint burning off the receiver. He could see heat shimmer rising from the breech. He didn't have a second barrel. Rinaldi had been carrying it when the mortar hit. It was somewhere in the rubble, buried under stone and flesh. So he kept firing. The assistant gunner's job includes watching the barrel, counting rounds, calling for a swap before the gun overheats and warps. Dvorak was doing the assistant's job, and the gunner's job, and the spotter's job with one working hand and a shoulder that screamed every time he moved. The pain was no longer sharp. It was a low, grinding presence that filled his peripheral vision with black spots. His right arm had gone numb from the elbow down. He couldn't tell if that was nerve damage or shock or blessing. He ignored it, not because he was brave, because stopping meant dying. The German fire intensified. Rifle rounds sparked off the stone walls. A Panzerfaust streaked overhead and detonated in the trees behind him, showering the position with burning fragments. They were trying to suppress him, close the distance, finish this. He kept feeding. Pull tout, fire, pause, pull tout, fire, pause. The rhythm was everything. If he rushed, the belt kinked. If he hesitated, they closed the gap. He had to maintain tempo, had to keep the gun cycling at a rate that looked deliberate, controlled, like there was a full crew working the position. He found a cadence, 2 seconds between bursts, just enough time to reset the belt, lean into the grip, and fire again. The Germans in the firebreak stopped advancing. They went to ground. That bought him time. But the base of fire element on the ridgeline was still firing. And now they had his position zeroed. Rounds were coming in low and flat, ricocheting off the stone, kicking up fragments that peppered his face and hands. Dvorak shifted his weight and traversed right. He couldn't see the ridgeline element clearly. Too much brush, too much shadow. But he could see muzzle flashes. He fired 3 bursts into the tree line. Suppressive fire, not aimed, just enough to make them think twice. It worked. The fire from the ridge slackened, not stopped, but reduced. The Germans were reconsidering their approach. He traversed back to the firebreak and resumed his rhythm. The gun was glowing now. The barrel was warping. He could see it in the way the muzzle climbed, the way the rounds were printing high and right. The sustained fire was destroying the weapon from the inside out. He adjusted his point of aim and kept firing. He had no idea how many rounds he'd fired. 300? 400? The ammunition belt seemed endless, but he knew it wasn't. He knew every burst brought him closer to empty, closer to the moment when the gun would run dry and the Germans would rush the position. He pushed the thought away and focused on the rhythm. Pull, tout, fire, pause. Somewhere in the 15th minute, the bolt began to stick. The gun was overheating. The tolerances were tightening. The extractor wasn't pulling spent casings cleanly. He could feel it in the recoil, a stuttering hesitation that meant the gun was on the edge of failure. He stopped firing long enough to pour water from his canteen into the receiver. Steam hissed up. The metal clicked and groaned. Water ran down the side of the gun, turning to steam before it hit the ground. He didn't care if it ruined the gun. He cared if it bought him another 2 minutes. It did. The bolt freed up. The cycle smoothed out. He resumed firing. Pull tout. Fire. Pause. His left hand was blistering. The heat from the receiver was cooking his palm through his glove. He could smell burning leather. burning skin underneath. He didn't stop. The Germans made one more push. A desperate, committed push with men shouting and firing on the move. They came out of the firebreak in a ragged line, moving fast, trying to close the distance before Dvorak could bring effective fire. They got within 30 meters. Dvorak dropped 4 of them in the open. The rest broke and retreated into the trees, dragging wounded with them. And then it was over. Not because the Germans gave up, because Dvorak's gun finally quit. The bolt locked halfway open. The barrel was warped beyond use. The receiver was so hot it was glowing dull red in the failing light. He sat there with his ruined arm and his ruined gun and waited to see if they would come again. They didn't. 23 minutes after Renaldi died, American voices called from the tree line to the south. The battalion had pushed forward. The flanking element had been cut off and destroyed. The survivors were withdrawing. Dvorak had held, not because he was superhuman, because he understood the machine. The medics arrived 12 minutes later. They found Dvorak sitting beside the gun, his right arm hanging limp, his left hand still gripping the ammunition belt. He was conscious but unresponsive. Shock had set in. They gave him morphine. They splinted his arm. They carried him back through the forest on a stretcher. He never saw the logging station again. The after-action report filed by Captain Raymond Haskell, Company G's commanding officer, noted that Staff Sergeant Dvorak's position had engaged an estimated enemy force of 40 to 50 men. The report estimated 12 enemy killed, with an unknown number wounded. It noted that Dvorak's M1919A4 was found with a warped barrel, a seized bolt, and evidence of sustained fire, despite catastrophic damage to the gunner's right arm. The report described the scene: Rinaldi's body in the corner, the warped gun, the empty ammunition cans, the blood trail where Dvorak had dragged himself back to his position. Haskell had been an infantry officer for 2 years. He'd seen courage before. But he'd never seen this. The report recommended Dvorak for the Distinguished Service Cross. He received the Silver Star instead. No citation was published. The recommendation was downgraded during processing, a bureaucratic adjustment common in a war where heroism was rationed like ammunition. The Army had quotas. The Distinguished Service Cross was reserved for exceptional acts. Someone in the chain of command decided that holding a position with one hand didn't quite meet the threshold, perhaps because Dvorak had survived, perhaps because there were too many heroes and not enough medals, perhaps because the paperwork got lost somewhere between Germany and Washington. Dvorak spent 6 weeks in a field hospital in Belgium. Surgeons saved his arm but couldn't save his hand. The nerves were too damaged. The bones had healed wrong. He retained partial function. He could move his wrist, could grip large objects with difficulty, but fine motor control was gone forever. They offered him a medical discharge. He declined. He wanted to stay with his unit. The Army compromised. They transferred him to a logistics battalion. He spent the rest of the war loading trucks and filing supply reports. He never fired a machine gun again. Dvorak survived the war. He returned to Pittsburgh in June 1945. He married his high school sweetheart in August. He went back to work at the steel mill in September, operating a crane with his left hand and his partially functional right. He worked there for 32 years. He raised 3 children. He bought a house in Homestead. He coached Little League baseball. He voted in every election. He paid his taxes. He wore a brace on his right hand for the rest of his life. He did not talk about the Hürtgen forest, not to his family, not to reporters, not to historians. His wife asked once, early in their marriage. He told her he'd been wounded. He told her his assistant gunner had died. He told her it was a long time ago, and he didn't like to remember. She never asked again. His children knew their father had been in the war. They knew he'd been wounded. They knew he had a silver star in a box in the basement, but they didn't know the story behind it. When the Veterans History Project tried to interview him in 1998, he declined. When a journalist tracked him down in 2001 and asked about the one-handed feed technique, Dvorak said it wasn't a technique. It was just what you did when the other option was dying. The journalist asked if he considered himself a hero. Dvorak said no. He said Rinaldi was the hero. Rinaldi had died doing his job. That was heroic. Surviving wasn't heroic. Surviving was just luck. The journalist didn't understand. He pressed the question. Dvorak ended the interview. He died in 2006 at the age of 88. Pneumonia. He'd been in declining health for 2 years. His children were with him at the end. He was buried in Allegheny Cemetery with full military honors, a 3-volley salute, taps, a folded flag. 37 people attended the funeral, family, friends, a few veterans from the VFW post. None of them knew about the 23 minutes. The M1919 A4 Browning was designed in 1919. It served in every American conflict from World War I through Vietnam. It was air-cooled, belt-fed, and designed to be operated by a 2-man crew. The manual specified that sustained fire required an assistant gunner to manage ammunition feed, barrel changes, and malfunction clearance. There was no provision in the manual for one-handed operation, because the manual assumed you had 2 hands. Dvorak proved that assumption wrong. The improvisation he used, wedging his destroyed arm against the pistol grip to create a fixed mount, then feeding with his offhand, was not doctrine. It was not taught. It was not even theoretically possible according to the weapon's technical specifications. The M1919 required approximately 5 pounds of trigger pressure. The bolt moved at high speed during cycling. The belt had to be guided smoothly or the gun would jam. Every military manual, every training document, every field instruction emphasized the same point. This was a crew-served weapon. But it happened, and it worked. The one-handed feed became a footnote in a battalion report that nobody read until a military historian digitizing Hürtgen records found Haskell's original recommendation in 2003. The historian, Dr. Alan Merrick, published a paper on improvised crew-served weapon techniques in combat. Dvorak's case was mentioned in 1 paragraph. The paper was read by 411 people. Most of them were academics. None of them were machine gunners. Merrick tried to contact Dvorak for follow-up research. By the time he located him, Dvorak was in hospice care. Merrick sent a letter. Dvorak's daughter read it to him. Dvorak said he didn't want to talk about it. Merrick respected that. The paper was published without Dvorak's testimony. It included Haskell's report, medical records, a technical analysis of the 1919's operating requirements. But it didn't have Dvorak's voice. Nobody ever heard what it felt like to feed that gun with 1 hand. Nobody heard his assessment of whether it was replicable. Nobody heard whether he thought about Rinaldi while he was doing it. Those details died with him. The Hürtgen Forest Campaign lasted from September to December 1944. The Americans suffered 33,000 casualties. The Germans suffered 28,000. The forest was taken. The war continued. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine in March 1945, the Hürtgen was a footnote in a larger story about momentum and cost. But for the men in Company G on November 14, 1944, the cost was specific. Rinaldi died in the first minute. 11 others died in the fighting that followed. Dvorak held for 23 minutes with a gun that should have failed in 5. He held because he understood that machines don't care about doctrine. They care about physics, leverage, friction heat dissipation, cyclic rate. Dvorak knew the M1919's cycle time. He knew the belt needed tension, but not speed. He knew the gun would overheat, but not immediately. He knew his ruined arm could still provide resistance, even if it couldn't provide control. So he used what he had, a shattered forearm as a mount, a left hand as a feeder, his body weight as a brace, his understanding of machinery as a guide. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sustainable, but it kept the gun running long enough to matter. And in the Hürtgen forest, in November 1944, long enough to matter was all anyone could ask for. The lesson isn't about heroism, it's about adaptation. When the system breaks, you rebuild it with what's left. When the crew is gone, you become the crew. When the manual says 2 men, you become 2 men. Dvorak didn't invent a new technique. He solved a mechanical problem under pressure. He reduced the weapon to its essential function, cycle, feed, fire, and built a workaround that met the minimum standard. That standard was survival. His survival, his squad's survival, the position's survival. He met it with 1 working hand and a gun that was designed for 2. The M1919. A4 in question was never recovered. It was likely stripped for parts or discarded during the advance. The Army did not track individual weapons through the Hürtgen. Too many guns were lost. Too many records were incomplete. Too many men died and took their equipment with them. So the physical evidence is gone. What remains is Haskell's report, Merrick's paper, and a Silver Star citation filed under Dvorak's service record, noting conspicuous gallantry without specifying the nature of that gallantry. The one-handed feed died with Dvorak. It was never taught, never standardized, never tested under controlled conditions to determine if it was replicable or if it was a singular event specific to one man's anatomy and one gun's tolerances. We will never know if another gunner could have done the same thing. We will never know if the technique was viable or if Dvorak simply got lucky with the way his injury presented, the way his body weight distributed, the way that particular gun's tolerances held up under abuse. But we know Dvorak did it. He did it for 23 minutes. He did it with a compound fracture in a gun that was cooking off rounds from residual heat by the time the relief column arrived. He did it because the alternative was unacceptable. And when it was over, he went back to the steel mill and never spoke of it again. That's the story. Not the heroism, the silence afterward, not the medal, the missing citation, not the technique, the man who invented it and then forgot it. Because men like Dvorak didn't fight for recognition. They fought because the gun needed feeding and there was nobody else to feed it. So they became the feeder, they became the mount, they became the machine. And the machine kept running. For 23 minutes in a stone shack in the Hürtgen forest, one machine gunner with one working hand held a position that doctrine said required 2 men. He held it because machines don't care about doctrine. They care about input and output, force applied, rounds fired, results delivered. Dvorak understood that. He'd understood it in the steel mill. He'd understood it at Fort Benning. He understood it in the Hürtgen forest when his partner died and his hand shattered and the gun kept running because he made it run. Understanding was enough. Not always, not for everyone. But on November 14th, 1944, in a forgotten corner of a forgotten forest, for 23 minutes that saved 11 lives, understanding was enough.